Hello and welcome. Thanks for coming to our non-game fishing tips version of Ask an Angler. So today we're going to be going over all and everything non-game fish. We'll talk mostly about the bigger species, our gar, carp, buffalo, but then we'll touch on some micro fishing for all of our darter and shiner and sucker species that could be anywhere from a couple inches all the way up to several pounds depending on the species. So we'll go through some of the things that you might look to use, where some good spots to go, especially as we're coming into the summer, typically targeting non-game fish for the most part, is best during the warmer weather. As the water temperatures come up, those fish are more active, especially in rivers and your big reservoirs where your game fish, might be retreating out to deeper water. A lot of times those bigger non-game fish will take advantage of, kind of cruising the shoreline at this time of year as we get into June, July, August. So lots of opportunities to catch some really nice sized fish at the lake. So summer camping trip or anything like that, where you just happen to be around a body of water, odds are you can probably get into some pretty substantially sized non-game species. So that's what we're going to be going over today. These are meant to be conversational. So any time during the course, if you have a question and we want to touch on it, just go ahead and enter it in and we'll address them as we go. That way we don't have to wait till the end and you might forget. So I'm going to start off with gar. We have 4 species of gar in Oklahoma. Long nose being the most prevalent. That's the one that most people encounter. Short nose gar and spotted gar, which are seen less often, but are still abundant in the state. And then alligator gar, which are in the Red River system, mainly in Texoma. So you may get reports of people catching alligator gar and, whatever lake. Odds are it's a short nose gar. They have similar nose structures. Alligator gar, to our knowledge, are in the Red River system, and that's it. So they're naturally occurring in the Mississippi Delta. Some of these species from back in the day, attained sizes up to like 10, 11, 12 feet of some of the earliest recorded alligator gars. So they can get up to a substantial size. Oklahoma's record right now, I believe, is in the mid 200s, like 250, 260. But regularly fish in the 50 to 150 pound range are caught when you target alligator gar. And with them, you're targeting them with usually circle hooks and a big cut piece of carp. Alligator gar, that's pretty much their primary food sources. They kind of just lay in wait on the bottom of rivers or holes, and they don't expend too much energy, and they just wait for carp that kind of swim by and they grab onto them. But that's kind of their favorite meal is a carp or some type of sucker fish. So typically, if you're going to go alligator gar fishing and you're trying to hook them with rod and reel, you're not trying to snag them. That's what you're looking. You want to catch a carp first. Get yourself just a nice common carp, and cut fillets off of the side of it, big chunks, and throw them out there. But with alligator gar, they're a long-lived fish, but there are studies, parts that we've taken part in, that show a very, very high mortality rate of even cutting the line on circle hooks, even small ones. The fish just aren't able to process them through their bodies. So keep that in mind if you do go alligator gar fishing, that even if you're cutting the line and releasing the fish, there is a high chance that that fish will die days or weeks later as it tries to process that hook. So it gets so far down in their gullet where it's not just rusting out, like when you're cutting it on a bass. In order to hook alligator gar, and gar for that matter with hooks of any kind, their mouths are too hard. You may get the rare occasion where you accidentally get that hook somehow in the mouth to reel the fish in, but more often than not, you're fishing for alligator gar. You have to allow that fish to take the bait, swallow the bait, which can take several minutes because they'll hold on to it, and you'll see your bobber moving up, upstream or in a different direction. And you have to wait 60 seconds, 90 seconds before you think about setting that hook. And even then, they could still have it in their mouth and swim in. But there is a very high mortality rate for fish, even when you cut the line. So just keep that in mind. They're a long-lived fish. They're very cool, but they've gotten a bad reputation, and they have been commercially fished to eradicate. And in a lot of places of the country, they've been completely eradicated. Oklahoma still has a stronghold in the Red River, and we'd like to see it kept that way. Yeah, I mean, Texas Parks and Wildlife, they've done studies. We've done joint studies, lots of different theories, but for the most part, we have seen pretty poor mortality rates for any size hook of swallowing. So just something to keep in mind. Most people don't fish for alligator gar 365. So, but if you want to go catch a fish of a lifetime, a big, 150 plus pound fish, just keep that in the back of your mind. You might not want to be doing it every single day, especially if you're cutting line, because odds are the fish isn't going to survive. But you can catch our other species of gar, which are in just about every body of water of the entire state, not using hook lures, but using rope lures. So I tied this just before we started this course. This is just a piece of nylon rope that has been braided out, and I just put a couple pieces of ripple flash. It's commonly used in fly tying for like streamers and things. You can find it at most big box like retailers that have fly fishing equipment or anything like that. And you can probably find it at like art stores, but these are pretty cool. So this is about a 6-7 inch profile, and we're just tied on with just a little zip tie into our swivel. So I'll kind of go through the steps of how to do this because the way my camera is facing, I can't put it down so you can see, and it can take a little while, but I'll just kind of walk through the steps because this is a cheap, easy, effective method if you want to go gar fishing, and especially if you fish a lot of rivers. This time of year, they're getting up for their spawning run. They congregate in great numbers, and if you have never caught a gar on rod and reel, I highly recommend it, especially the ones that fall into that 3-4 foot range, long nose gar. They'll tail walk like a tarpon. They're a whole bunch of fun. So maybe you've spent time bow fishing and you shoot a gar and there's not really much to it because even a big fish is only about that big around. Not a lot of resistance when you go to shoot them, to reel them in. But man, you put them on the end of a line, they will take drag. They'll peel off upriver. They'll go downriver. They'll tail walk. They'll jump. So they're a pretty fun fish to hook into. And, you can catch fish from 1 foot all the way up to, 40, 50 pounds for long nose. So all you need to do this is just some basic rope from any hardware store, just a basic nylon rope. So what we do with this is I always want about 2 extra inches of how long I want my lure. That's for my tag end when I put it through. So this is a pretty good length right here. This is going to run us about 6-7 inches to here. You can see I don't have a whole lot of rope left anymore. I've been using this same strand probably for 4 or 5 years tying lures. I think it started off as maybe a 20 or 15 foot piece of rope. So not a whole lot. And one strand like this will make 4, 5, 6 lures, maybe more. But you need a pair of shears, something heavy duty that you can cut through the rope with. And all you do is you just cut yourself off a little 6 to 8 inch segment. It's going to look like this. And all you're going to do is just start unwinding all of those strands. And you just keep going until you get to the solid pieces that don't really want to come apart anymore. So you'll end up with a whole bunch of pieces that look like this. And really all you need, like I said, these will make, just that one section is going to make, probably it's going to make closer to like a dozen, depending on how thick you want to make them. But for instance, this lure that I just tied, this one is only 3 of these strands. So, you can see I've got a whole mess, and here's just 3. And what you would do with these is I take 3, you get a profile that is about this. So not about the same size as your finger in diameter around. So this is a really good bait profile. Gar looking to grab something, and they get it right in their beak, and then they work it back down. So you can use a bit longer profile because those fish are used to grabbing some bigger minnows and things. But in order to get a lure that looks like that and that consistency, all you need is 3 of your strands of these little ones. And they're just going to look like that. Not much to it. And all you do is you just hold them together and put them down on a table that you don't mind scuffing up a little bit. Usually a good folding plastic table works perfectly, or a workbench or something. Just get yourself just a cheap wire brush. These are like $1.99 at a Walmart or anywhere. And all you do is you're just laying it down flat. So you just hold it in your hand just like that. And all you'll do is you'll just keep working the brush long ways. So when it's laying on the table, you're going to be putting pressure, and then just keep scraping it until it frays out and you get, your rope pieces looking similar to that. And once we got to that point, what we would do is we would take our swivel, and again, nothing fancy to this. Here's my little Ziploc bag that's got some weights, zip ties, and my swivels in it. I like to use a fairly large size swivel. In comparison, this is a pretty good size swivel. Just gives you some room because you do have to get, the rope to go through. So there's a few different options for ripple flash. It's going to come in a bunch of different color. It's going to look something like this. So this is just basic silver kind of iridescent flash. Then we've got one that's blue. We want to do like a mixture blue back, or we have just kind of black that's got iridescent through it. So you can get as creative with these as you want. You don't have to put flash in them. You can just do it. Like this one just has a couple of pieces of that silver ripple. So it just gives it a little extra shine in the water. Makes it look a little bit more like a darter or a shiner that's moving around. But you could just do the straight rope. That's going to catch a fish. So when we have this threaded out, what we'd be looking to do, and it can take some time. My brush, I need to kind of straighten it out. So it took me a little while earlier, probably a couple minutes. So I'm not going to spend all the time just threading this out, but we'll just say for sake of argument that it is. And all you do, you just take a couple of pieces of that flash and put it in there. You could, make it to where you have maybe a black back or a blue back on the top of the lure, and then a little bit of the silver flash kind of through the middle. And then what I do is you just kind of twist the top off so that you can fit it through your swivel. It helps if, you take your scissors again, kind of cut it down and get yourself a really nice, consistent tag end to put through the swivel. Makes it a little bit easier. And then I'll just wet it just so you can get it nice and tight around when you go through that swivel. And you just take your barrel swivel, and then you just make sure that you get those pieces of ripple flash to go through with you. And then you would just pull it through 2 or 3, not even quite that. But as you can see, it can be a little bit difficult in this stage if you don't get those pieces kind of lined up and consistent, especially the ripple flash. That really doesn't like to go through. It tries to fight against you. So you may think about using 3, 4, 5 pieces of it, knowing you'll probably lose a couple when you go to thread it through. But just enough to turn it over so you have your tag. And then you would just take a very basic, these are really small zip ties. So not a very big one. And then you get it started. Just make your loop first to get it going. And then pull that over the swivel down to the base of where you have the tag end through, and then you're just going to cinch it tight below the actual swivel. You don't want to do it above. So it's going to get nice and snug right up against there. Pull it as tight as you can until it stops clicking. Then you cut the excess tag off right here. Where are the cutters? Clip that. And then what I would do, so this in theory would already be a little threaded out, but you can do it this way if you want to just do this so you have something better to hold on to. And you could build it like this and then start the process of fraying it out, and you will end up with this in the end once you fray it out enough. So depending on your wire brush, the surface you're using, you could get to this in a few brush strokes, a dozen maybe. Or in the case of my brush, it probably took me 40, 50 strokes to get this to fray out to look like this. But super simple. You can keep it. And it's great because you get somewhere. I try to bring my gar bag with me as much as I can. You obviously don't need a lot of stuff. Everything will fit right into a Ziploc bag for you because you can cut off some of the ripple flash strands. You don't need to bring the whole wad with you. You could just cut, several strands off, throw them into a bag. And then all you need is a bullet weight, and that's it. So you would tie, where did my bullet weight go? We'd take this, we'd put our bullet weight onto our main line, and then tie whatever fishing knot to the other side. You're going to cast that straight out and just straight retrieve it. You might pop it or pause it if you want to, but they like to attack, especially up in the shallows. So if you just kind of work the edges of a river, or especially if you see them rising a lot, just dragging it right through them. I like to use a light bullet weight, just something to get me subsurface that's not going to pull me down to the bottom. Gar tend to feed a little bit higher up in the water column when they're active. When they're getting things that are near the bottom, that's typically when they're busting on the shoreline, chasing bait fish in. So when I see gar, I'll just, make several casts up a little bit upstream. If you were in a lake, doesn't matter, just cast right into the big pool of them when you see them, and just a slow, steady retrieve. And it's fun because this one is actually a pretty good lure to start. This is really nicely frayed out for me. A lot of times I don't take the time to make them look this nice, because what will happen is once you start getting bit, the fish will actually do the work for you. So the more fish you catch, the better your lure actually becomes, because they keep fraying it out, which gives it more pulsing action in the water. So this is just a really good cheap bait. I mean, you can make 100 of these for $5. So it's a pretty good deal to have for gar, and they're super fun to catch because they have their teeth, so you don't need the hook. They grab onto this, and that nylon rope grabs onto their teeth. They cannot open their mouth to get it out. So the one handling practice that I would say for gar, that you probably need to practice when you're doing it, so that you don't injure yourself. Most dangerous part of the gar is not their teeth, it's the scales on their back. They are like little arrowheads pointing in a rear direction. If you have your bare hand on there and that fish slides backwards on you, it's like putting your hand into a bear trap. You do not want to do that. So whatever hand you plan, let me grab my gar bag. So I always keep at least a pair of, just some type of glove to have on. Typically I'll have it on my non-reeling hand. So I reel spinning reels with my left hand. So I would have this on my right hand. And then when I go to get the fish, I'll hold on to the fish, and then you need pliers to pry the lure out of the fish's mouth. But like I said, the more bites you get, the more fish you hook up, it actually frays out your lure and makes your lure better. And you probably will get dozens of fish on the same lure before it's been crushed, especially if you leave. That's about as much tag as I leave when I clip it, just enough so when sometimes you don't get that, you don't get the zip tie perfectly tight. Just that's usually plenty, that if you can do this and it stays, you're good. But if you clip it too close, a lot of times that first real good pull, it's just going to rip it clean out of the deal. So just leaving yourself a little bit of tag end. And that's a gar lure. See, place the hook on. Yeah, I've seen that a lot. Inline spinners would replace the hook with a rope. That's a pretty common one amongst gar anglers. So you have lots of different options for gar, but if you never fished for them before and you spend a lot of time on rivers or creeks, this is a great time of year to get them in bulk in certain pools and runs, especially at the confluences of like minor tributaries that run in. For example, here in central Oklahoma, the Cimarron River, where it bends and Skeleton Creek comes in, there's a hole at that confluence that you can get to from just downstream at at a roadside parking area right up against the bank, and you can walk up that the roadside bank till you get to the confluence of Skeleton Creek, and they can stack up in there pretty exponentially. It's crazy. I've been there where it felt like you could walk across the water on them, and that happens in most of the major creek and river systems that we have in the state. And then also out on your big lakes, Eufaula, for example, has a ton of gar in it. And you can find them in bunches surfacing, especially this time of year as they're getting close to their spawn. So definitely a non-game fish, worth giving a little bit of effort to, because the second that you hook that first gar, it could be a 7-pound fish, it could be a 30-pound fish, but the first one that you get, when you watch it tail walk and watch it drive back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, it you put a lot of weight on them. Rod and reel setup you could get is, you get a big heavy action catfish rod with 30-pound test on it. Or you could use a medium action bass rod with 10-pound test on it. It doesn't really matter. It's just whatever you want to get out of the fight, but they'll peel some drag off for sure, even on those bigger rods. But definitely worth getting after some gar if you get the chance, and you get to tie your own lure, which is pretty cool. Anytime you get a chance to catch fish on things that you personally produced is just even more rewarding. So talk about some of our other species that we have that are pretty common, prevalent in every body of water that can attain some bigger sizes that are fun to catch. Drum, you're going to catch drum. Drum are probably, of all the non-game species outside of gar, but because of the way gar's mouths are made, you don't have the same type of hookup success. They'll hit crankbaits, they'll hit rattle traps, they'll hit soft plastics, but more often than not, they're grabbing it and you can't actually hook them. So you snag them more often than not. But drum is fishing. I kind of think a drum is kind of a lazier bass, a lazier largemouth bass. They're going to take just about anything. They'll take spinner baits, they'll take soft plastic, grubs, swim baits, tubes. They are kind of an omnivorous fish that they can attain some pretty good weights, but an average sized drum is usually going to be somewhere around 2 to 4 pounds. So it's a decent sized fish when you're using medium action equipment, lighter test, 8 to 12-pound test. They'll give you a really good run for your money. Anywhere where you go fishing, it doesn't matter where you're fishing, what you think you're targeting. To get started, all you need is a small hook, small bait holding hook, and a worm, little piece of worm. You can throw that out into any clear water creek, muddy prairie stream, big reservoir, small lake, pond. Your best bet is always going to be fishing off the bottom with a piece of worm, whether it be a red worm or a night crawler, completely up to you. That is going to yield the most amount of fish anytime you go somewhere new. It's a great way to fish at camp. You got kids, family members who haven't really fished that much, but you went on a camping trip, you're at the lake, you're on the river, throwing out rods with just a basic setup of some type of casting weight, egg weight, even just a few pieces of split shot, just however you can get your line to go down to the bottom. And then anywhere from, a size 10 through size 1, even size 0 hook. So fairly small. You can get, once you start getting into like micro fishing, things like that, you might really start to look at getting size 14, 16, 18 hooks. But for all intents and purposes, you cannot go wrong fishing with just a piece of worm on a small to medium sized bait holding hook fished off the bottom, no matter where you go. That is always, that just right off the bat, that's going to yield the most fish. As you fine tune and really maybe want to get more into a particular non-game species, you start looking into more specialty type baits. So for example, with like a carp, you can YouTube homemade carp bait, and you're going to find dozens, if not hundreds of different videos of people who have made what they claim to be the greatest, most surefire, gonna catch carp bait that you can make. Some guys make it with mixing Mountain Dew and cereal and grains in a big 5-gallon tub and doing that until it turns into a paste. Other people will use like Jello extract and mix that in with fruit punch and Wonder Bread, just however you can get globs of scented bait in the water. But you can't beat just a basic piece of worm off of the bottom to start. And that's just going to get you on fish. And the great thing about it is you never know what you're going to catch on that. So you get great bycatch. Most of the time in the summer, it's going to be those non-game fish. But this time of year, late May, early June, when we still have lots of game fish that are up in the shallow water, that are going through their spawning, their pre-spawn and post-spawn feeding cycles, you can catch anything. I mean, bass, walleye, saugeye, sunfish, catfish. So worm in a bobber or worm off the bottom is always your best bet anywhere you go to start. But with drum, you're going to see some more activity with drum in different parts of the water column. You can find them really close to shore. Typically, I find the most success catching them like that with just a worm and weight off the bottom. If I'm out in a boat and I'm on the lake, one thing that I've found that gets their attention pretty good, that is a walleye bait, are just going to be your very basic harness crawlers. So this is what a harness crawler looks like. I'll take one of these out that I've already used, so it's not quite as tightly wrapped. This is my go-to for drum when I go take boat around Lake Hefner. So you'll buy these. Northland Tackle makes these, so you'll find them at like a Cabela's and a Bass Pro. Let me get this unwound. So they're all going to come in a nice, sometimes they come in a 2 or 3 pack. Other times you can buy them in bulk or singularly. It just depends on the retailer and what they have in stock. But you get it unwound. So this one I've actually cut the leader on. Most of the time from where the first hook is and the spinner to the end is usually typically a lot longer than this. I cut this one down. I didn't want it. I was getting caught up in a woody area of the lake, so I just shortened my leader. But anyways, these are very basic. You have a spinning blade, and what this is a float. So I just run these. You can use whatever type of bottom bouncing weight you want, any snag free. Do I have any in here? No. I just use a little Lindy. If you ever seen a Lindy rig. So a Lindy rig is essentially just this, but instead of having our spinner and our little float, it's just all it's going to look like is this. It's just going to be a hook. Sometimes it's a singular hook, sometimes it's a double hook with the snell. And you just put a worm on that and you get a little half crooked weight. It's kind of turned upward. I just use those weights at Hefner. It's mostly soft bottom, not a lot to get hung up on, but you can use big, long stick snakes, anything that's a non-snag weight. And you just put that on your main line, and then you would just tie that onto your main line. But with these, what you do is you just take your night crawler. So we're going to use a soft plastic and nothing fancy. Just take one end of the night crawler, get his head on there. Usually what I'll do is I'll double wrap it. So I'll get it on there. I'll turn it over, put the hook point through one more time, just for a little extra security. And I'll do the same thing with the bottom hook. So I'll get that worm lined up and stretch the worm out so that I don't have any clumping. I want him to be straightened out as much as possible. And then we're just going to take our hook, going to put it through once. And then again, I just double it over for safety, just so if something takes a swipe at it, it doesn't rip the worm off. And all you do with this is cast this out behind your boat, put your rod in a rod holder or hold on to it, and troll at like a half mile an hour, just like you would for walleye or catfish or anything like that. And this spinner goes, so this is off the bottom like this. This float will be back here, and it's gonna raise up off the bottom so that you're not down in the nastiest of the stuff. And it's just gonna raise you up just a little bit. And this is gonna flutter around back here, just like a spinner bait. You got the worm, and that's how most people fish, or a lot of people fish for walleye. It's very effective. So at Hefner, you can run the big humps out by the dam in 60, 70 foot of water in the summertime. But if you run the flats out along the lighthouse where you go from 30 feet of water up onto the shelf and you're only in 12 to 4 feet of water, depending on how far up the shelf you are, catch drum after drum after drum after drum, just using this. Tons of fun for anybody who just wants to reel in a good size fish, because you probably have 100 yards of line out, give or take, somewhere between 50 and 100 yards of line out. So that's a considerable distance, which means when you do get hooked up and you're in the rod holders, when they hammer them, it sets the hook for you because of the tension from trolling. You hand the rod to somebody and they get to reel in, usually somewhere between a 2 and a 12-pound fish, which is tons of fun for everybody. I love catching them. I'm out there trying to catch walleye, but I'm not mad when it's another drum because they give you a pretty good fight. But if you're fishing from the bank, they'll go after rooster tails, inline spinners. What I've really found a lot of success on drum with artificials are soft swim baits. So like little Storm pre-molded, like the smallest versions, the bluegill, the ones that look like shad, but then just like baby shad, something that, here's a crappie box, but things that look like this, especially the ones that have little swimmers on the back end of them. So here's a really, really small sassy shad. This is probably labeled as a 2-inch, but this is more like 1.5 inches, 1 3/4. But you just put like anywhere between a 32nd to an 1/8 ounce jig head, depending on water depth. And if you just swim this around dam and riprap, you'll be amazed how many drum that you'll find over time. And you get a lot of good bycatch that way. Soft plastic swim baits, especially the smaller versions, ones that are in the 1.5 to 2-inch range, paired with just a basic ball jig head of some kind, could be painted, could not, whatever, just somewhere between a 32nd and an 1/8 ounce. Slowly retrieve them and they'll hit them just like bass. But because it is a swim bait, you get lots of good bycatch, because you might catch saugeye, you might catch crappie, you might catch largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass. So this is always a good go-to for drum. But unlike some of our other more specialty non-game species that are a bit smaller, especially our micro species that are fairly easy to catch, but you're using very specialized equipment. With drum are basically, like a bass in the water. They will suck the bottom. They're omnivorous, but they will easily go after bait fish. So always having a soft plastic swim bait with you, especially if you're at a lake, and one that you've never fished before. Work in riprap, work in all the typical places that you would fish for game species using a soft plastic swim bait of some kind, and you're bound to find some drum if you make enough casts. Bottom bouncers, yeah. So strawberry jello carp bait, yep, all good on that. So let's talk about what do we want? Carp. So carp, best place to catch carp is going to be in marinas that have food. Some marinas let you fish in them, some don't. So always pay attention to whether there's signs on a dock or in the parking lot, or when you drive your boat into a marina, because it may say no fishing. Water rights are a little funky in Oklahoma. There's lots of people who own lots of different water, but nobody can actually own the physical water that's owned by the state of Oklahoma. But the shorelines and the ground and all that. So just always best to pay attention when you pull into somewhere. But marinas that have restaurants are your best place to start for carp. You're going to have some monster fish in those areas, and you're going to have fish that are actively looking to feed. What kind of bait would you look to use in those situations? So all forms of carp are non-native fish, not from America. Most of them have their species dating into like East Asia. Some are from the middle parts of Europe, but no carp that we have that are what people consider carp. We have some river carp suckers that are native fish, but are actual species of carp or not. They're a smart fish. They're kind of like you can think of carp like you can think of feral hogs. It's an invasive species that is smarter than all the other species that are native, that it is now out competing and better at getting resources. So Carp are a big problem. Most of the time, people don't really notice them, but they can take over a water body. They can do damage to the ecology and to the fish structure. So with carp, always remove them. Uh, you can puncture the swim bladder on them and toss them back into the water so they sink. Otherwise, you're going to have to find a normal method of disposing of them. You can't just throw them on the bank, or you can get written a ticket for wanton waste and something else about putting fish where they can become exposed to the environment. So if you're out on a boat and you're bow fishing, you just poke holes in the swim bladders, you can sink them. Turtles and other fish will eat them. But if you don't do that, they float up to the surface. You'll also get written a ticket for that. So um, being able to identify carp, we'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about bow fishing and some other methods to take. But if you're looking to catch carp on rod and reel, they are very smart. They are hook savvy. They can feel tension. It's a pretty incredible fish. So it's actually become increasingly popular amongst fly fishing anglers to take carp on flies because they have no scent, and carp are a sight and scent feeder. They have lots of good different organs working for them that give them kind of a heady advantage over a lot of other species. So they are a difficult fish to hook up on, even using basic baits that, will catch them. So you can always go with a worm. That's never going to hurt you. But when you get with carp, especially if you get into a marina, I like to use whatever the food source might be. So if you're in a marina that's got a restaurant and, it's some type of an American restaurant of some kind where they serve burgers and fries, most people throw fries in the water. It's hard to put a potato chip on a hook, but you can put fries on a hook. And that's how I fish for carp. So if I can fish in a marina and there's a restaurant, first thing I'm doing is going and getting an order of fries, and I'll just take a small bait holding hook. Cause again, they get really hook weary. So you got to be quick on the hook set. And anywhere where they're congering around, you'll usually see a pack of them swimming around. I'll just take a bobber, just a basic bobber. Again, I try to keep it as concealed as possible. So I'll use a really small bobber, something that looks like this as opposed to this. So this is a big bobber. This is just a small little peg one. Not a lot of resistance for something like this. All I'm trying to do is just keep my French fry somewhat near the surface, but they can turn their nose up at it. So, I'll usually use like a little octopus hook. I'm a big fan of thick wire, small octopus hooks. They got a nice wide gap on them. So usually I get a good hook set on the top part of the mouth, near the lip, which is where I want the hook. That gives me most control of the fish. But carp are a bony species. They have a ton of power. So you got to make sure that you have a good drag set because they're going to peel line. And then also that your rod can handle it. I've broken plenty of ugly stick on not that big a carp. I mean, under 30-pound carp have easily broken medium heavy action ugly sticks that I've owned. If you don't have that drag set, they have that much power when they go to run. So I would just take a little bobber like this, put my line a foot or so below it, and just a little octopus hook. And if this was my French fry, and where did my hook go? And this was my hook. I'm gonna nose hook the French fry. So if this was our French fry, I would just take it through the bottom of the French fry and come right out the nose of the French fry, depending on what type it is, and it would just be like that. So that means when that carp comes and grabs the fry, it's already sucked it all the way in before it ever feels that hook point. So my bobber has gone underwater before that fish knows that French fry was not free floating, because I have watched carp come pick up dough balls. One of my favorite carp baits when I'm fishing in like a cove or at like a public access, a beach, if there's an area to fish and you have swimming area roped off, there's typically carp nearby in the backs of those sandy coves. I always used to just go buy a cheap bag of Wonder Bread, pull the crust off of the Wonder Bread, so I'm just left with the white, and then just put it into fourths, and then take one of those quarters and just ball it up in your hand until it's a perfect circle, and then I just pull that onto a treble hook. a really, a treble hook that doesn't have any points exposed so that the fish can't feel it. If I can, I will throw that out with no weight. So I'll just throw it out. The treble hook is enough to sink the line down to the bottom, but then there's nothing on it because those carp, if you're using like a quarter ounce, a half ounce weight, when they grab that bait and pick it up, they immediately feel the tension and they'll spit it right out. Even with no weight, I've watched carp come in 5 feet in front of me, pick up my bait in front of me, and before I could set the hook, I watched them spit it back out. So they're pretty impressive on their intelligence. But man, when you get one hooked up, they can fight. I mean, there is outside of smallmouth bass, I don't know what can turn a rod over in comparison to size than just your basic common carp, grass carp. They have a ton of power to fight. So that's kind of how I go after carp. Now, another option, some lakes are different than others. Just your basic magic bait that you'll see at every Walmart, every Bass Pro, every Cabela's, most mom and pop bait stores are going to have bags that look just like this. This is mulberry. They come in like 4 or 5 different flavors: strawberry, chocolate, vanilla. There are tons. I like the mulberry, but sometimes you can have great success with these on just a little tiny octopus hook, bury it, or a little tiny treble hook and bury it. And again, I cast it out, no weight on it, let it sink down to the bottom, put my rod in a rod holder, prop it up on a cooler, back of a truck, just wherever I can monitor it. And what's good about not using weight is if the fish can pick it up and you've concealed your hook so they can't feel anything other than that bait, they take it in, they realize it's a natural bait, so they're not looking to spit it right back out if they can't feel that hook. And I can see my line. So it's not going to be taut. You're not going to have the nice bend over like you would if you were trout fishing off the bottom or fishing with a worm off the bottom with some weight where you want to get it tight to your rod tip so you can see the bite. You just reel it up so you don't have so much slack that it's bowing in the waves and moving your bait around. If it does happen to be a little bit windy that day, you're probably going to have to use weight, but as small a weight as you can use. I always start at 1/8 of an ounce. If I can hold the bottom with 1/8 of an ounce without getting my line pushed everywhere, that's where I'm going to start. Then I'll go up to a 1/4 ounce, half ounce. But you start getting up to a half ounce, it's going to be really tough to catch carp. You can catch other species using like the dough baits. You're going to catch, drum will eat that, catfish will eat that. So you're still going to find fish. But for carp, you have to be very finesse with carp because they're just so smart and they have so many sensory organs that tell them what's real, what's not real, their reaction time to it. But throwing something like that out there, let it sink. And all you'll see is because your line's not completely tight, you'll see your line start to move. So it'll either start to get really slack because the fish has picked it up and is swimming towards you. So in that case, you pick up reel until you start to see the line start to get tight. And the second it gets tight, you set the hook. Otherwise, it's like, okay, the fish has picked it up. It's swimming away from me. It's swimming left or right. It's just 1 or 2 reels to get tight back again and then set the hook. But that's how you're going to have the most success catching carp. You might get bit a lot, but like I said, they are so fast to spit out whatever you're offering. Keeping your bait completely concealed with no weight on your line is going to give you the best opportunity for that fish to hold on to the bait just long enough that you have a pretty fair chance of hooking them up. You know how I can find out what public creeks I'm allowed to wade and fish? I'm afraid of getting on private. Yeah, so here in about a week on June 1st, our smallmouth bass stream angler guide is going to come out. It's going to list all, the best public access spots for clear water fishing in the state. Those are all going to be good access points. Oklahoma does not have a ton of river and creek public access. The little bit that we do is almost exclusively on the eastern half of the state. But we own three properties now on Barren Fork Creek, which is an awesome creek. If you can ever get over to Barren Fork, it's about 20 minutes east of Tahlequah. It's a tributary of the Illinois. We own 2 properties on it, and there's 3 other access spots on the Eldon Bridge, the Welling Bridge, and then Boy Scout Hole. And all 3 of those are maintained by different entities. ODOT runs the Eldon Bridge, GRDA monitors the Welling Bridge access, and then Corps of Engineers manages the Boy Scout hole. But that's a great one to start on. So that stream angler guide, when it comes out, is going to give you kind of the most comprehensive list of public access, along with links directly to them. So when you pull them open on your phone, your desktop, laptop, however you're accessing the information, it's going to default to whatever your map system is. So it's going to give you direct directions to the parking area, or the access site. And those are going to be your public access sites. But that'll be a very good resource when it comes out here in about a week. Yeah, one of the largest carp tackle retailers in the U.S. is Bartlesville. Oklahoma is plumb full of bait and tackle companies and rod building companies. We don't get a lot of national press as far as our fishing is concerned, which is probably a good thing. It keeps a lot of people from coming to Oklahoma every year. But we are a fishing mecca. A lot of the innovation, definitely most of something fishing related that you've ever bought was made right here in Oklahoma. So that's pretty cool. We fun to live in a state where we have such a great fishing culture, and everybody has their little niche within that. And non-game species are definitely, I don't think a non-game species in the sense that I'm just targeting them most of the time, unless I am micro fishing specifically for darters, shiners, small non-game fish. But if I'm just at the lake, especially the big reservoirs, it's fun with family and friends to have the opportunity to catch some bigger sized fish using the same exact equipment that you would use in your local pond or farm pond to catch sunfish. You might have to wait a little bit longer. It's not going to be quite as fast and furious most of the time. But on a typical day at the lake, give yourself an hour or two, you're probably going to catch at least 5 fish, just using a worm and throwing weight and just letting it sit on the bottom. Between carp, drum, all of your game species, anything that's going to swim by, that gives you the best chance at catching the most amount of fish, as well as, the potential to catch a really, really big fish, especially the later we get into the summer when those non-game fish really push up into the shallows. So buffalo are a native species. Unfortunately, too many buffalo are shot every year during people bow fishing or tournaments, partly because there's not a lot of information that exists out there about the need to protect buffalo fishes, which are long-lived fishes. Your buffalo fish, your drum, those are native freshwater species to Oklahoma. They're important to the ecology of the water. They're important to the fish structure, which includes your sport fish. But they're outcompeted by carp. And identifying the difference between a carp in the water versus a buffalo especially is not the easiest thing in the world to do until you really start to focus in on them. So if you do bow fish, we really ask that you try to shoot non-native fish, which are going to be your grass carp and your common carp for the most part. We don't really have a sizable enough population of the big head and silver carp yet to where you have prevalent fisheries for that east of us. Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, Illinois, their rivers and creeks have been devastated by those types of Asian carp. But we just really deal with common carp and grass carp in Oklahoma. So anytime you're out bow fishing, you got a rig. Here's a good bow fishing setup right here. I like these cans the best. You have a few different reel options. Zebco makes a screw-on, basically looks like a Zebco, any of their basic spin casting models. They make one for bow fishing. I think it's like an 808. And it screws in right here where the stabilizer would go on a bow. And you can reel that in. The problem I have with that is that you tie that line directly onto the arrow, whereas this one has a slider on it. So pull this off. So this has a slider. So this can move up and down the arrow when it's shot or when it penetrates a fish. So it puts less tension. This rope that we have in the can is a much thicker rope. It's twice the size of the rope that comes in those Zebco setups. So you're going to get more value out of these as far as hooking big fish and retrieving them. The reel on these are not meant to reel in the fish. When you miss, this is just a way to quickly get your line back to you, because if anybody remembers how we used to bow fish, it was putting basically a pop, you got your stabilizer and you got a Mountain Dew bottle, you got some type of can, and you had to hand wind the rope after every shot, hit or miss. So somebody got tired of that and manufactured a couple of different reels that allow you to pick your line back up. But it's just enough tension to be able to pull the arrow back in. You won't be able to gain anything on a fish, and it's bad for the reel. So basically, when you've shot the fish, you just hand line them back in. If it's a very, very big fish, maybe you're fishing with other people, you might need to put another arrow or two in the fish to get it in. But if bow fishing is of interest to you and you have, a budget of let's say somewhere between $200 and $400, you can buy the bow, the setup, arrow, all of that in a package right off the shelf. You can use any old bow you may have lying around that you don't hunt with anymore, and you can modify those to put the different attachments on it. But this is my favorite setup, is just going to be these basic tubes. I believe they're AMS brand, and come in a couple of different deals, but you're all going to get the same rope. And then you buy the arrows that have sliders on them, and you can tie these sliders on in a couple of different ways. This one was tied on just using just a basic line to line through and tying it off. A lot of times, what I'll do, I didn't tie this one on, is I'll tie a loop knot, and I'll put the loop knot through both sides, and then I'll bring it over one end of the arrow and then the other. That way, if I need to remove the arrow, because what you can do with these, they have a little screw at the top, and you can take that piece off, and then this will slide right off the arrow. Some people do that to remove the arrow, like if they're traveling with it or if they're putting it up wherever they keep their bow. But they've got some pretty cool attachments that come on these cams now, where you can just put your arrow right back on it. So basically, it's the length of the bow. Your tip isn't exposed to hitting anything because you'll hit the cam first, and this side's about the same length. So pretty safe traveling. The nock is the more dangerous side than the actual tip is on this. But this is a pretty good setup for bow fishing. But you can bow fish with any type of bow and equipment, because before we had all of this, which really hasn't existed until the last decade or so, we've all been creative with ways to shoot arrows at bows. Now, these bow fishing setups are nice. They're typically tuned in between about 25 and 40 pounds a draw, which you can pull back all day long. 20 pounds will get the job done. 17 pounds will get the job done. 40 pounds you can shoot a little bit farther with a little bit more speed. So when you got to drive the arrow into the water. But if you are bow fishing, light refraction. So having polarized glasses on so you can see into the water, and understanding that the light refraction means the fish is lower in the water than it appears. So when you're aiming at a fish, preferably you're shooting at it with more of a downward trajectory than you are a horizontal trajectory. You really want to be driving that arrow down into the water. The flatter the shot is, when it hits the water, it's going to kind of kick it back up. But if you can see the full body of the fish, because we don't have sights, because we've removed the sight to put the cam on to shoot the actual rope with the arrow, there's no sight. You can make notches on your bow if you want to, but it's pretty easy to just eyeball down the arrow to where you're going to release at. You put that arrow tip at the base of that fish. So if you're looking at a whole fish, you want that arrow right on the bottom of them, and more likely you're going to hit it in the top third of the fish. You still might miss a little high, but your miss is always going to be high when you're shooting into the water. So you got to aim. In some cases, if they're at depth, typically we shoot fish in 1 to 3 feet of water, so that our arrow penetration is not that great to have the buoyancy of the water mess with the flight of the arrow, especially if you're only shooting 17, 20 pounds that you can't break through. It's going to stop that arrow. If you're trying to shoot a fish in 6, 8 feet of water, then it's a trig problem basically, because you're shooting maybe 3 or 4 fish low, like below where the fish is. You're aiming this much lower than the fish because that arrow is coming way up when it hits the water, and that fish is just deeper in the water than you think it is. So something to think about. But if you are out bow fishing, we do encourage you to learn your species identification. And if you're not fishing a tournament, if you're not trying to make some money, that day, and you can be more selective with what you're shooting, we encourage you, try to shoot carp, get good at identifying carp, and try to let those 40, 30, 50-pound buffalo that are long-lived fish continue to live, because those longer-lived fish technically, or a lot of times, don't reach sexual maturity until a much later age, which is then going to affect the next generation of those fish. So plenty are getting shot right now. There's still lots of non-game fish, but definitely when you can do your part to help clean out non-native fish and let native fish live, go target buffalo on rod and reel and see if you don't get hooked on catching a 20, 25-pound buffalo, tear and drag out, and you're fighting the thing for 30, 40 minutes. So that is something to think about. Non-game fish, they get very bad rep, especially the native non-game fish. They're called trash fish. They're called rough fish. They are a very important fish. And for whatever reason, anglers, those fish had bad public relations people, apparently, because I don't know why you wouldn't want to target a 40-pound fish that's fairly easy to catch instead of going after a 3/4 pound and a half crappie or a 2-pound bass. There's a lot of fun in catching big non-game fish, and most non-game fish are pretty big. So you got any more questions? Nope. Okay. So let's talk about some places to go. So somebody mentioned public access on creeks and rivers. So the Illinois River system is going to be the most access that you get in Oklahoma to river water. The Department of Wildlife runs multiple public access locations, essentially from the Chewy Bridge, which is basically the turn of the river as it goes back towards Arkansas to the headwaters. There's public access at the Chewy Bridge, and then all the way downstream to Horseshoe Bend, where it's dumping into the lake. There are a dozen public access sites. Most of them allow overnight camping on them, which is great. Float operators are no longer able to use those public access sites to launch or take out their rafting. So those gravel bars now will be much better for the public wanting to just go enjoy those areas without buses and vans and trailers continuously going through. So you're paying attention to your kid, your dog, all that traffic. It won't be there anymore. So this summer, get a lot of more peace and quiet at those public access areas as far as wet wading is concerned. But those are a great place to start. Blue River. If you've never been to our Blue River property, we own almost 6.5 miles of continuous river. So again, tons and tons and tons of public access. There's lots of different types of fish in the Blue River. You can get into some pretty cool like river red horse and some river carp suckers that are in there, flathead catfish. But Blue River, it's got some nice primitive campgrounds that we maintain. It's a really nice property. The only thing about Blue River, don't stray too far off of what are the trails. This time of year, all of the riparian zone underbrush is going to be riddled with poison ivy. So you want to be able to get in the river and wet wade by staying in the water and then taking out at a waterfall where there's a well beat down trail that you can walk out from. Other things to pay attention to at Blue River: snakes. There is a decent population of cottonmouths that are at Blue River. Tons of water snakes. You see lots of water snakes. I fish at Blue River, several times a year during the warm weather months. I've seen one cottonmouth. It was few yards upriver of me in waist deep water, and it was a good, solid, mature adult snake that was about that big around. That was my one experience. I would like to not have one of those again, but they are out there. And then the long grass, the Johnson grass up along the roadways. Sometimes you go wet wading and you got to bushwhack your way back out to the road to get back to the parking area. Ticks and chiggers. So if you do not want to have your good experience be ruined several days later because of bug bites and poison ivy, if you're at Blue River, get yourself in the water on a well-beaten path and stay in the water until you can get back out of it on another well-beaten path. You start getting into the brush, you can run into some issues. Now, the Illinois and the Barren Fork are great. They're cobble bottom streams, huge floodplains, so big gravel bars, tons of wading room, lots of good casting. So if you fly fish, tons of bat casting room, and we have the most public access for different river miles of those two water bodies. So that's a great place to start. Awesome place. It's spring fed water, stays nice and cool in the summertime compared to some of our prairie streams that can get into the, mid 80s, almost 90 degrees, especially on drought summers. That also have, a ton of non-game fish in them. You're going to find lots of carp and buffalo and things like that in the Cimarron, in the Canadians, in Deep Fork, in the Arkansas River. Those are going to be great areas. So if you live in the Tulsa area, right there in downtown, all of the public access spots that are along the Arkansas River, those are great sandbars to go try to catch buffalo, carp, drum. There's plenty of prairie river species that move through there that are fairly sizable. Not to mention, if you're throwing just a little basic swim bait out there, you can get into sauger, you can get into striped bass, hybrid striped bass, white bass. So a lot of good bycatch on the Arkansas River system. If you're fishing the Illinois system in any of those areas, worm in a bobber or worm off the bottom, great starting place. If you fly fish, small nymphs, and you don't even have to fly fish to be able to do this. So here's a couple of nymphs up in my box up here that are fairly small. These are going to run anywhere from size 14 to size 18 up here. Basic patterns. So Oklahoma, we have mayflies, we have caddisflies. Those are our two big bug species. So pheasant-tailed nymphs for your mayflies, little caddis emergers, little caddis nymphs. Those are going to be your great starting point. But you don't need a fly rod. You can throw those nymphs on a spinning reel, like I got behind me, on a bait casting or a spin casting, because all you need is a bobber. So you using a round bobber of whatever size, that's going to be enough weight to be able to throw it out there. Because if you just tied a fly onto the end of a spinning outfit and went to throw it, your line's not going anywhere because there is nothing. The whole point of fly fishing is the line is allowing your line and rod are allowing you to throw something that is essentially weightless. So instead of it being the weight of the lure itself, giving you the propulsion to be able to chuck it out there, with the fly, your long rod and your fly line is what is allowing you to move your bug and get it to the water. So you can fly fish with artificials that aren't flies, and you can use things that you would normally artificial or bait fish with to throw flies. So what you do is get a fluorocarbon leader. So fluorocarbon sinks, and it is pretty much invisible underwater compared to your other two types of commonly used fishing line. 7 pound test is usually enough. 6 or 7 pound fluorocarbon is going to be plenty. This is 10 pound, just so you can see it better on the screen. But all I've done is just taken a basic round bobber, and on our little notch right there, instead of running our line all the way through, I just tied a basic improved clinch to the bottom of this. So leader line's nice and snug, ain't going nowhere. Then you would take the end of that leader line and pick your bug. Something small, little flashy lightning bug, little tiny pheasant tail nymph, crackback caddis, Bloody Mary, Copper Johns, all of your very basic, generic, size 16, size 18, size 20 nymph flies that you will find at any box retailer. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of fly shops in the state. If you're down at Beaver's Bend, maybe stop in one time if you're trout fishing and get yourself some little, some of those types of nymphs that you can use later. But you tie it onto the end of your line. And what I like to do, you don't have to do this. You can literally just use monofilament main line and run your bobber through. Because what happens here is I need to know my depth of where I want that bug. If I'm fishing different sections, I don't have the ability to move my bobber up and down to adjust my depth. That's the only drawback if you're going to go with a leader line. But you can use monofilament and just move this up the line, and this would all be attached. But what I'll do is I'll take my braided line. So like my spinning setups right here, I have big long fluorocarbon leaders tied on them currently, but underneath this is 10-pound white braid. And so what I would do is I would take my big long fluorocarbon leader and cut it at the braid, and I would tie my braided line onto this because it's high vis, it's white. So just like fly fishing, I like to nymph without a strike indicator. So this is a common fly fishing, what's called a strike indicator, because fly anglers don't like to say the word bobber, but that's what it is. Here's a bobber. But you have a fly line. So I won't put a strike indicator on. I'll just watch the end of my fly line where my leader's tied into it because it's bright, high vis floats. And any movement that I see in my fly line is when I go to set the hook. So what I do with the bobber is I'll just tie braided line directly onto this high vis braid floats. That's something to think about. If you're using, like most of my river rod and reels for smallmouth bass, other warm water species, I'm using like 6-pound fluorocarbon as my main line. Well, it sinks. So if I was to put a bobber on that fluorocarbon, all of the line from my bobber back to my rod tip is going to be starting to get sucked underwater, which is then working against me. So either monofilament or braided line to your bobber. And then if you're using monofilament, you can just go ahead and just put the bobber on like you normally would, and just however deep you need to get it. And then if you have braided line, you just put braided line on this. And with braided line, I'll tie a Palomar knot. So you get that piece open on the top, string your line through, tie a Palomar knot, throw the bobber through, cinch it tight. So basic way to fly fish without using a fly rod. And then if you're a fly angler, all the stuff I just said, but with your traditional fly fishing equipment. Rivers and creeks, floating line. If you want to go after some of the bigger species, especially like in the Illinois, where there's some big bottom fish, whether it be drum, buffalo, carp, any type of the different river suckers that are in there. Some of them are big. I mean, we're talking upwards of double digits. So in that case, you might elect to start using maybe a 6 or a 7 or an 8 weight. If you're in Barren Fork Creek and the biggest fish that you might find is maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 pounds from a non-game fish, a 3 to a 5 weight. I like using a 3 weight. I'm a fan of light action tackle, whether I'm using traditional spinning or bait casting equipment, or if I'm using a fly rod, I like to use a 3 weight, 4 weight, and then medium light action or light action rods of my more traditional. But that's just me. So however you like to get it set up. But if you're going to be targeting bigger fish, a 6 to an 8 weight. And if you don't really care, you might want to play a fish longer than like a 3 to a 5 weight. Floating line, again, leader, you're safe with the 3X, but you can go up to 6X. If you're going to throw that 3 weight, maybe a 6X leader and maybe like 4X, 5X tippet, a couple of feet, just so you have some chew line to tie on bugs. But if you're going to use a 6 to 8 weight, probably a 3X, a 2X leader line tied on to maybe 2 to 4X tippet, maybe 0 to 2X. Just depends on how big a fish you want to target and what your tolerance is for fighting fish. If you want to make sure that you get it in, always sizing up to make sure that you're not going to get broken off is going to help you. But it's completely up to the angler. Is there a specific rig that favors bank fishing? Depends on water flow. So if you're fishing still water, like a lake or a reservoir or a pond where you don't have a lot of current that's working against you, you're going to be just fine throwing a worm in a bobber. I like fishing off the bottom if I am targeting non-game fish. If I want the opportunity to get into carp, to get into buffalo, to get into drum, then I'm going to be fishing off the bottom. So like I said, I'm going to start with an 1/8 ounce casting weight. If that's plenty to hold, not going to bow my line, that's what I'm using. If I have to size up, I'll go all the way up to a 1/2 ounce. If I'm having to use more than a 1/2 ounce to hold my line from the bank, then that's probably not the type of fishing I should be doing that day. Because once I get to that weight, it's easy to miss bites. Fish are going to take your bait all day long. It's just, if you have to use that much weight, because you can cast pretty far with an 1/8 ounce weight. Remember, if you're using a big catfish rod, a big 7-foot, thick, medium action rod with like 20, 30-pound test on it, you're not going to be able to throw that 1/8 ounce weight very far. But sizing up to an ounce weight, 1/2 ounce weight, just so you can throw that rod because you want to have the heavy line and the heavy rod to catch that big fish. You don't need it. This is just a little banger rod. These ugly stick GX2s, they run anywhere, right now with inflation, they're probably $60, but they run anywhere between like 34 and $54 at Walmart's, Bass Pros, Academies, wherever you can find. These are great. They're 2-piece. They're 6-foot rods, so not very big, just a medium action rod. I get a lot of these, rods that I've had a lot of success with, that I have a lot of confidence in, don't break, they travel well. For me, a $50 rod is not a huge, I'm not buying a $200 custom made rod. So I know I'm going to get some value out of these, and I trust them. So I'm willing to spend 35 to 45, $50 on what I consider a beater rod, something that's going to get thrown in the back of my truck. It's going to get banged up. It's going to target mostly big non-game fish but I trust these rods. So whatever rod you get, but all you need is a medium action rod, even to fight 20, 30-pound fish. And then I put a decent reel on it. So instead of buying a bunch of different nice reels to put with every nice rod I have, I've got a 6 really nice spinning reels, and I just pop them off of my bass rod or my walleye rod, and I'll throw them on my banger rod. And then typically, however I have them rigged up for that, may need to cut off whatever leader line I have tied on. But this is my setup. And I'm just going to throw a worm off the bottom most places that I go, especially if I haven't been there before. And then because I have a nice spinning reel, my drag is set really nice. So when I hook into a big fish, a 10, a 20-pound fish, even though it is tripling over this rod, I have just enough to steer the fish, but not really control it. But my drag is just allowing me to fight that fish. So when I can gain line, I gain line. When I can't, get a nice smooth drag, doesn't break my line. I might have to fight it for 10 extra minutes than I would if I was using that bigger setup, but I might not have even hooked the fish in the first place if I was using that bigger setup, because I had to use the heavier weight just to get my bait into position. So I will always take the lighter tackle to throw lesser weight, so it is giving more of a natural presentation, especially to a carp, that you have to do everything to conceal the fact that, what they're taking is not attached to a hook, whether it's a fly or bait. So downsizing your hooks, downsizing your weights, in order to conceal the hook or whatever you're using. That's pretty paramount for carp fishing. Now, drum will spend all day trying to get a worm off of a hook. They don't care about the hook point. They're like bass and catfish. They eat other fish all the time. They're used to getting those spines. If you've ever grabbed a panfish and didn't lay its dorsal fin back, and you found out that they have a few spikes right there that'll give you a pretty good poke. Well, when bass and catfish are eating those fish, they have them fanned straight up. So those fish are used to getting, poked in the mouth, which is why they are less hook fatigued when they grab something that pokes them. But carp are the exact opposite. If they feel anything, they're immediately spitting it back out. So downsizing your equipment is always going to lead to more fish. And then as you build up the confidence with that, you can start tailoring your equipment to the larger scale to go after larger and larger fish, utilizing some of the same practices. But if you're just looking to get out there, take somebody out, get on fish immediately and have a success rate, and if you catch a monster, great. If you don't, you're perfectly happy catching 2 to 4 pound fish all day long. Then a medium action rod, 10-pound, 12-pound test, small hooks, 2/0 or not 2/0, size 2 and smaller, all the way up to probably about a size 10 for just getting started. As you get more confidence and you get more into it, then you start experimenting with even smaller hooks and different setups. But size 2 to size 10 is going to be a great hook range to stay in. Could be a long shank Aberdeen hook. I don't recommend those. They're thin wire. Always use thick wire hooks, especially when you're targeting big fish. Those thin wire hooks, they can straighten them out. They can break them. Anything can happen. So just make sure you're buying a thick wire hook, which some of them are labeled. It says thick wire. Other times it might say like 4X, 2X, 3X hook, basically saying that it's 4 times stronger. It's just a thicker wire. But that's what you're looking for. Small to medium size, thick wire bait hooks of some kind. I like octopus hooks. You can use circle hooks. You can use mosquito hooks. You can use just basic, where's just good old basic hook. Something like this that just most basic bait holding hook. So here's a thick wire, kind of looks like an Aberdeen hook. Just something like that. But again, the smaller, more concealed you can get, especially if you're targeting trout. And then, same size range of treble hooks. Again, thick wire treble hooks, because if you only get one hook point in, it's one of those kind of thin, flimsy trebles, they're going to straighten the hook on that too. So keeping small weights, 1/8 ounce to a 1/2 ounce if you have to, but try to keep it closer to the 1/4, 1/8 ounce if you're holding the bottom, if you can't just throw it out weightless. Like I said, if I can throw out one of those dough balls or a piece of bread that I've rolled up or something like that, if I can cast it, 20 feet, it doesn't have to go very far from the bank, then I'm going to do that without weight, especially if I really want to catch carp. Let's see. What is your preferred bait for buffalo? So with buffalo, again, worms off the bottom are always going to find fish. If you really want to get into like the weeds of non-game fishing, there's lots of great YouTube videos out there. If you go to our website, wildlifedepartment.com, I'll just throw our non-game fish link up there right now that's got some videos, and you can go to the YouTube channel of that content creator, and it'll start to give you a bunch of related content. There's lots and lots of specialty buffalo, carp, drum specific videos where pretty accomplished anglers for those species give you lots and lots of really good tips on it. So here's just the link that goes directly to our non-game fishing videos. There's only a few of them, but if you click on any of those videos and take them to the YouTube channel, the right side of your screen, or if you're on a phone, down below the video is going to have related content, which is going to be other videos. So we just kind of give a brief snapshot on our website to, if you want to go down that road. But, for all non-game species, especially the big ones, buffalo, carp, drum, gar, river suckers, fish that can generally attain weights over 2 pounds, a worm on the bottom is your best friend. You can specialize from there. Like I said, there are people who swear that their Mountain Dew Chex Mix blend that they've made into dough bait can't miss. Like, that's the best bait ever made. So you're going to have tons of that out there. But if you're looking for just right off the bat, getting out there, catching fish, you're not trying to do anything fancy. You just want to catch some fish. Couple worms, weight off the bottom, and I'll usually get both. I'll fish with 2 rods typically for non-game fish, and a bag of dough bait of some kind. And one of them will have a dough bait on it, the other one will have a worm on it, and I will fish them against each other, and I will see if there is any preference from the fish for that particular day. Typically there's not, but I have found more often than not, the worm gets bit quicker than the dough bait gets bit. But the dough bait eventually finds fish, and sometimes the dough bait finds bigger fish. I think that's all just coincidental, but the worm off the bottom is definitely the #1 choice for any type of bottom fishing, in which most cases you're catching more non-game fish than you are game fish. But you have the opportunity for good bycatch of cool game species, especially walleye and saugeye. They love a nice worm off the bottom. So most of our lakes now have gotten saweye in them. A lot of them historically have had walleyes. So lots of toothy fish out there, and they love taking a night crawler off the bottom. So great bycatch in addition to targeting some bigger non-game species. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about targeting smaller non-game fish. So what we consider micro fishing. That's been steadily growing as kind of a niche audience in fishing that's gained a little bit more traction in the last several years of people kind of like with carp and fly fishing. It's just one of those sports that with fishing, people, they get bored with traditional things. You're always going to have somebody who's just, they've got that creative mind to go after something else or try to perfect something newer. So we've seen a lot of advancements in how people do microfishing, but you can make it as basic or as advanced as you want. One of the best baits that you can use for any species of fish in a river, especially a clear one, are going to be just your basic little, I don't even know what they're officially called, but it's a trout magnet is the brand, trout magnet. And all it is these little tiny worms. Some are these, you can buy them in a few different colors, but my two primary colors that I use are going to be that really bright chartreuse yellow or kind of more of a natural olive green. But these are the two that I use. I like the 196 head that they make for them. They make a 164th, but the 164th comes with a bigger body bait. So here's the 164th. And these are what came with like a 192nd jig head. So I favor the smaller ones, but again, I'm a finesse angler in any type of fishing that I'm doing. So I'm always using what most people would consider are really, really small. Most people look at an 1/8 ounce, 3-inch bait as kind of being a standard. I'm starting off on the 1.5 inch side and 1/32 ounce and smaller for most soft plastics that I use. So, but what these mimic they're called inchworms. They're all over the world. All fish know to key in on inchworms. So if you're having a bad day on the water, especially if you're trout fishing, these are going to be day savers. Just having these and let's see if I have one rigged up that's not. So what I'll do on my fly rod, my 3-weight, is I'll just do a dropper. So I'll have my top one tied on, and here's the jig head on those. Those are those 196, really small jig head. And then I'll do about a foot dropper, and then I'll have the other color. And then I'll just do that until I figure out which one the fish favors more. If they're just hitting the bright yellow, then I'll swap out and do double bright yellow, or if they're targeting that, double, or I'll just go to just a singular, especially if there's a lot of cover and hang-ups where it's just more advantageous to use one bug instead of two. But these are great. So really good starting spot. And these are going to catch sucker fish. Fish just know to key in on inchworms. And that's all that these are mimicking. And then as far as like your fly fishing, so that's the thing. When you start targeting micro species, darters, shiners, small suckers, they may attain good sized weights, maybe 1 pound, 2, 3 pounds, but they might only have a mouth on them like that. So we're having to use really, really small profile baits, lures, flies. So size 16 and smaller for flies, for sure, right off the bat. Like I said, they key in on our two main bug species, which are going to be mayflies and caddisflies. So having some size 14 through size 22 nymphs, really, really tiny guys that you can fish. And the reason that I like to not use a strike indicator or a bobber is I want it's kind of a European style of nymphing where they drag, like they use like tungsten weights, and they'll have a lead bug that gets down on the bottom. It's just basically dragging the nymphs on the stream bed. Whereas like most nymphing in America for trout is done below that strike indicator. So you're somewhere in the water column, typically in the bottom third of the water column or half water column down to the bottom third. But usually you're using that strike indicator because you do not want your nymph hitting the bottom and getting hung up on something. But when you fish like a Barren Fork Creek, where there's almost no vegetation, it's just cobble bottom, your nymph with the current, because of how light it is not going to get snagged when it hits the bottom. So it's going to be bouncing along the bottom like a nymph of that species would be doing. And those sucker fish know to key in on them. So when you go to Barren Fork and you see these big schools of these little tiny fish, and you kind of see that they're angled upwards, their tails are up, that's just because they are feeding through the stream bed. They're just vacuuming the stream bed. So that's the easiest way to do it. But you can get a really small, like a trout hook that you would use, like a size 16, size 18 trout hook, something like this. That's gold, real small. So this is a size 16. You could put this on the end of your line, like 4-6 pound test, and get like on those creeks where you can literally stand on top of the schools of these small micro species. You can just dangle that little gold hook in the water, and it's creating flash and those little fish will come. You don't even need to put bait on that. You can just use the gold hook. But if you take a red worm and just take a little tiny chunk of red worm, night crawlers are too thick, so they'll completely block the gap. So night crawler would be something like this, where when it's on there, it's basically just, it doesn't matter how much of a chunk you put on, there's just too much blocking that gap. So red worms work great for little tiny hooks, especially in creeks. And you just put and you just dangle it over the fish. I mean, you're just free lining it because you really can't cast something this small. You could on a fly rod, but if you're going to use a fly rod, then you might as well be using very small nymphs accomplishing the same thing. But if you want to just take a little light action crappie rod or panfish rod and just put the smallest little gold hook, little wide gap gold hook you can find, you can just dip that straight in the water and it gives off enough flash that they will come and peck at it. And that hook point's right there. So you can hook them up like that. Or you just put a little piece of night crawler, even a crappie nibble. And you can catch lots of different micro species. But that's a good time, especially if you spend a whole weekend maybe over in the Illinois system, and you get one day you go pound smallmouth pretty good, and then you're like, okay, I want to try something different and go non-game fishing. Barren Fork is a great entryway into fly fishing for warm water species, especially non-game and smaller micro species. They're abundant. You got tons of casting room. Water depths average about waist deep. Flows only 200 to 400 CFS, so it's super. Anybody can wet wade through that. Kids, dogs, people of different physical abilities are going to have an opportunity to be able to wet wade Barren Fork. So it's a great starting point. Our two properties, especially our Bamberger property, which has great access right onto the water immediately. Our new property, our Barren Fork WMA, which is almost in Arkansas, it's a little more primitive to get onto the water. You kind of have to traverse some pretty steep banks and kind of jump in the water. So that one requires a little bit more physical ability to get on the water. And there's some tighter turns and some deeper water in that section. So that's starting at Bamberger. And then if you really love Barren Fork and you want to try somewhere new and be more adventurous, then going over to our Barren Fork WMA is a great place to go. Second, the Eldon Bridge, the Welling Bridge, those offer really easy access right down on the water. But again, street water access laws in Oklahoma. I mean, ODOT owns both sides of the bridge, but how far you can wander up and downstream, you're technically on other people's property on the stream bed. So you run the risk of getting run out of there by the landowner. If you go to our properties, we own them. You can wade quite a ways up and downstream at both of our properties without ever getting on private property. So good places to start. Has it black and chartreuse? Okay. So again, if we get into, did COVID complications cause the three trout limit? No, the price of trout caused the three trout limit. That wasn't a COVID related issue. The cost of trout has been going up forever. They are very expensive fish to buy. We do not produce them in state. We purchase them from a third party vendor who is based out of the state of Oklahoma. So not only are we paying for the fish, but the cost of transportation and everything else to get them to the bodies of water that they get stuck in. It also coincided with a rule change that we made to our close to home bodies of water, which also made a 3 fish aggregate. And because we stock trout in one of our close to home waters now, instead of having 2 different regulations, 3 just became the number. But that it wasn't a COVID related deal for why it went to 3. It was just price of the fish became so great that we can still stock the same amount of fish, but with the 3 fish limit, we're giving more people that opportunity to catch, those fish when they get there. If it's a 6 fish limit, seasonal bodies of water, usually, it doesn't get stocked, but every 2 weeks, pretty easy to clean out those fish, especially when you can keep 6. So 3 just kind of levels the playing field for all anglers. We're still stocking the same amount of fish. It's just your daily creel has been cut in half so that those 2-week windows in between stockings, we get a little bit more value for more anglers to keep 3 fish if they'd like to. But that's the reasoning behind that. Let's see if we got anything else. It's kind of all I got. So if you got any questions, now is the time to answer them. We appreciate everybody being here today. Like I said, you can get into the weeds of all these different species. There's going to be an article coming out was written by one of our wildlife biologists over on the eastern half of the state. He's really gotten into microfishing last several years, and he's created what he calls this like life book of his fishing life list of all the species that he catches. And there's something like 160 odd species of fish in Oklahoma. And I think he's caught in like high 80s up to 90 of those fish. Some of them are only this big, some of them are suckers, but that'll be a cool article when it comes out, just to kind of get a glimpse of the types of fish that you can catch. But Barren Fork is definitely my recommendation for a Clearwater Creek to get yourself started on non-game fish, especially if you're wanting to take the fly fishing route. That's going to be your best public access, easiest wet wading, and there's an abundance of fish. So most of the time you're just going to be catching smallmouth. But if you size down and you kind of stay away from the more smallmouthy areas, the dump-ins to pools, the runs that have structure in them, the tail outs before the next pool, if you kind of focus on kind of the slower moving water of the deeper runs, or the shallow kind of riffly sections where the water has some soft water, you'll see the schools of those different species of darters and shiners and suckers. And you can sight fish for them. So a lot of times, you're just watching your fly line or watching your bobber, but you kind of know where your fly is at. So you're kind of anticipating getting a take. So instead of dry fly fishing, but a dry fly is also, so I didn't touch on that. But again, caddis, mayfly. My go-to bug for mayfly hatches, and I think I actually have it tied onto one of my rods right now. Let's see if we can find a small one. Here we go. So this is my go-to bug. So when you see those little fish that are slapping the water, so if you go to Barren Fork anytime during the summer, fish are gonna be slapping the water left and right. Most of it's non-game fish that come airborne and things. They're hitting emergers. You might have, some dries, but a very small mayfly pattern. This is pretty tiny. So size 16, size 18s, they're very hard to see on the water, but it's got a yellow body with some purple flash through it. That is the bug that I like if I'm going to throw a dry in Oklahoma when I have mayflies in the area, whether they're landing on the water, laying eggs. If I see fish rising, I'm going to go with the floating bug. You could throw an emerger on there, like a mayfly emerger, but you need to have bugs that are actually hatching on the water. More often than not, when you're seeing bugs, they're landing on the water, they're laying eggs, and then fish are coming up and getting them if they've been crippled or they got too much water on their wings and they can't take off right away. So just something small, size 16, size 18, little mayfly pattern. I like a yellow body or an olive body, something that's kind of a lighter natural color with just a little bit of purple flash in it. Always seems to get them going, especially if you have rising fish. Your other good options are going to be just your very basic. I like a rubber leg, kind of like almost a caddis hybrid. Kind of have a body of a caddis, real short tail like a caddis. So here is a tan body, like size 14. Now this is size 16 hook. Size 16 caddis, little tan body. Looks like this. You see them labeled as elk hair caddis. So we don't have the triple tail off the back like we do with the mayfly. So I like to fish, whether it's with flies or it's with artificials. I like baits and lures that are very multi-purpose. So what I mean by that is the fish could mistake it for several different prey options. If you're using a swim bait, it's a swim bait. It's mimicking a fish. It's not mimicking anything else. It is a fish moving through the water. So if they're keyed in on eating bait fish, it's a great lure. It's hard to outfish that. But when it comes to like a fly, I'm going to take something that kind of has that caddis appeal to it. Again, very small, like size 16s. But I got some rubber legs. I've got kind of a caddis tail on it. And then I've got almost like a mini ant or hopper type body. So this could be mistaken for a few different things from all those fish. It could be a terrestrial bug, a cricket, a grasshopper that's fallen on the water, in which case you can get away with a little bit of movement in your drift because a terrestrial bug struggles when it's on the water. When you're trying to match the hatch with a caddis or a mayfly, you don't want anything move, you want a drag-free drift because that's what that is going to look like. But when terrestrials hit the water, they're not meant to be on the water. They struggle, they kick, they're flapping, they make a lot of commotion. So anytime you can use some rubber legs. I also really like a rubber-legged stimulator. This is just a smaller version of essentially a rubber-legged stimulator, but it's kind of got ant hopper pattern as well as a caddis pattern off the back. Nice natural body color, olives, tans, yellows. That's going to be the base of your bugs, especially during the summer months. But so the same thing goes for like nymphing. Real small. My go-to bug is a rubber-legged yellow Sally, or just something that's got. So this one doesn't have rubber legs. Yeah, it does. It's kind of soft rubber legs. Every fly tire uses different materials. But something like this. This is my go-to bug, little yellow Sally. So we got our rubber legs. We got kind of our tail, like a pheasant tail, our mayfly tail. Again, get lots of. This could be a bunch of different things. Could be a hellgrammite. Could be a mayfly. Could be a stonefly. I like bugs and lures that I get a lot of different representations out of the same thing. That way, if they are keyed in on something very specific, I have better odds. I don't have to go through 4 different lures or flies to identify that exact pattern. I kind of have all 4 mixed into one. So rubber legs, tubes. This is kind of, if you've ever watched any of these before, you know that I have a big infatuation with little squirm and squirt tubes. So 1/64 ounce jig head inside of an 1.5 inch green pumpkin red flake squirm and squirt Bass Pro Crappie Max tube. I fish this everywhere. This started off as my smallmouth go-to. It has since evolved into just about my go-to for everything, anywhere I go. But this will catch non-game fish that can get it in their mouth. Mostly drum. Drum will hammer these. I've caught a few random like sucker fish and darter fish that have taken a swing and just got unlucky and found the hook point, this is certainly not your most advantageous bait for targeting small micro species. You can catch them, they will chase, but most of the time they can't get over that hook point. But ever end up at Barren Fork, pack of these, you'll be hammering smallmouth all day long. So I try to mix in my micro fishing and non-game fishing on creeks and rivers in with my smallmouth fishing, especially when I don't have a lot of time. If I maybe just have one day or one afternoon, trying to maximize my efforts, get the most value out of the trip. But those are kind of your basic deals. But really, if you're looking to non-game fish, you are probably going to be using bait. Artificial lures, while they will have success, until you've built up that confidence, or maybe you have confidence in those types of lures and flies currently, start off with gaining an understanding and an appreciation for those fish by catching them the easiest way possible, which is with a chunk of worm fished off the bottom. So if you're fishing in a creek, 1/8 of an ounce is going to be plenty in Barren Fork to hold the bottom. If you're in the Illinois and you're in some deeper, faster moving water, you might have to go up to like a 1/4 ounce. And it's probably more advantageous to be able to kind of position yourself upriver, casting downstream. If you cast cross current from the bank, your line is going to swing until it finds an anchor point, but you're still going to have the current trying to push your line. So if you can get dead upstream, which the best places to do that are a pool that dumps in, so you get the riffle section that's only about this deep, diving into a pool that turns into a big long run. You just sit your lawn chair right where the pool dumps in, and you're only in ankle deep water, so you got a nice cool breeze and water coming through, and cast your line straight down river, and then you're just nice tight line with just again, size 2 up to size 10 hook to start specializing from there. But a little piece of worm off the bottom, you're going to start to rack up the fish. And then from there, you might want to turn it into artificial fishing or fly fishing. And now you kind of have the principles, especially of where the fish sit. It's so important when you're looking for fish in streams and creeks of where they orient. Those bass are going to be in ambush locations. Suckerfish, they want the slower flow, and they're looking to pick off bait that maybe has been hit and wounded that's floating down. But they're looking for that slower moving water. They will push kind of into the shallower areas, or you might even have like some shaded areas in the tailouts. But that's really what you're looking for. And once you build up that confidence, then when you go out to fish for your warm water game species like a smallmouth bass, where they're sitting in the river. You also know where you have a better chance of catching those non-game fish, because they typically like a little bit different habitat even in the same small body of water. When you're on a lake, especially a major lake, big reservoir, sandy coves, marinas, places where food gets thrown in the water is going to cleaning stations at docks, boat ramps, if they have a cleaning station where people are chucking fish guts in all the time, that's just naturally going to congregate, especially scavenging fish. But they like those sandy shoals to cruise around on. That's what they're looking for, especially as we get into the summer months. And you'll see lots of activity, daybreak and at dusk, but you'll find fish that will move in and out of those marinas and coves all through the course of the day. So being able to just have worm weight fished off the bottom, you're going to find success. So let's see, when does the 2022-23 regs go into effect? So it depends on the reg. Most of the time it's whenever the governor signs the rule changes. So for our state statutes, our Title 800, most of those go into effect July 1. But there's other rules that go into effect based off a legislative signature. So it could be November 15th or September 15th. So any of the new reg changes, typically we list in the book when their effective date is for each reg. If it doesn't, call your county game warden. They're going to be able to tell you exactly when it goes into effect and what the rule is. So your county game warden is always going to be your biggest advocate, in the county that you're hunting or fishing in, because they know the local intel. They're always going to be able to provide probably the most up-to-date fishing reports because they are checking anglers, so they know what's being caught, where they're being caught. They're a great resource to use, and they like hunting and fishing. So when you're calling them not to come help you out with something, you got a cat in a tree or a nuisance critter. If you want to call them and talk about hunting and fishing, they're usually, most of them are going to open right up to you and tell you all the info you want. So always take advantage of reaching out to a department employee. We love talking hunting and fishing. If you got this link through email, you have my information. Call, text, email, all those contacts at the bottom of the email. I love talking fishing too. So anything that we can do to help you out, get you pointed in the right direction. If you couple of top places, we got about 15 minutes. So if you got any more questions, go ahead and throw them in there. One of our big buffalo lakes that has seemed to produce fairly large size fish on average is WR Holloway or Chimney Rock or Pumpback, 3 different names for the same lake. But right there over in East Central Oklahoma, that's proven to be one of our premier trophy buffalo lakes. Gar in lakes, they're going to be everywhere, but Eufaula definitely comes right to mind when it comes to big congregations of lake gar. Grand Lake's got a ton of gar. But getting up, working your boat, or if you're bank fishing up those tributaries that come in, the Cimarron River off of Keystone, the Canadian off of Eufaula, Spring Creek, Elk River, Neosho River off of Grand Lake. Those are all going to be, chock full of different species of long nose, short nose, and spotted gar. Arbuckle's got a ton of gar in it. They push up into the creek tributaries to spawn. Rock Creek, Guy Sandy, Buckhorn. So the mouths of those areas are good locations for gar. Carp, drum, they're going to be dispersed, statewide in pretty good numbers in just about every area of the lake. But you're really looking for marinas, state parks, public access areas that just get food thrown into the water. There's always going to be fish that are congregating in areas like that. And then when you're on creeks and rivers, prairie streams, your carp, your buffalo, they like to get up onto what's considered the riffle section. So the very shallow sandbars that work their way into a turn in the river that dredges out the big pool. Once you get into the pool, that's good for gar. The gar like to push to the shallow side of that running pool. They'll push bait fish into that shallow bank and go after them. That's where you can find some decent gar fishing. Throwing the rope lure out, but most of the time those non-game species are going to be deeper into the run. They won't be pushed up where the pool dumps in, and they'll favor the non-current side. So basically the seam line where that faster moving water is starting to meet the slower moving water that's typically coming up onto more shallow, kind of just gradually sloped area of the gravel bar. Your sucker fish, your drum, your carp, river suckers, they like that kind of little seam line because food comes down and it kind of gets forced over into that, and it really slows it down for them. They don't typically like to be out in the rushing fast water. It's just with the way their mouths are oriented and how they're feeding, that's not very advantageous for food to be flying past them. Whereas a bass is hitting upwards and from behind. So there's no big deal for them to be able to go quick grab strike. But when you think of a sucker fish that's having to casually go on the bottom, if the food is just flying past it, it's having a more difficult time. But if it can sit back in those seams where the water is kind of gets an even depth, even current, the water's really slowed down, then all of the food that's just kind of bouncing along the bottom and bumbling, they're able to really key in those areas. So those are going to be where you see the fish. And the great thing about the bodies of water on the eastern half of the state, you're sight fishing for non-game fish. If you can't see fish in the water, don't fish there. These are big fish for the most part, especially if you're not micro fishing. And even micro fishing, you're typically sight fishing for them. You're finding schools of cardinal shiners or silver-side shiners or hog-nosed sucker that, even hog-nosed sucker or northern hog suckers, they get, sometimes there'll be 12 or 13 of them sitting right together and they kind of move in a pack. So you're always sight fishing. Now, smallmouth bass, you don't see them. They're ambush predators. So they're hiding at the bottom of the river where a pool dumps in, or they're up underneath a bank or a piece of wood hanging tight to that. So you might see the smallmouth actually come and grab the bait. It'll flash across the middle of the water column or the bottom of the water column. And it's so crystal clear. And you're just like, how can I not see that fish sitting there? They're so well camouflaged. Those non-game, especially the bigger fish, even the small, they stand out. So you're sight fishing for them. So don't just go throw your worm into a run where you can see the bottom and you don't see any fish swimming around. You can move around. You'll find those bigger sucker fish. And on the Illinois River, if you float that, I mean, every gravel bar that you stop at, if you look into kind of those runs that have that prototypical water where it's kind of moving out into gradual flats, you're going to see some pretty sizable groups of non-game species in those areas. So those are great ones to hit up if you really want to get into the multi-species, different size range. The Illinois and the Barren Fork, those are your two top bets. There's also good public access on the Glover River, but that requires a land access permit because it's in cooperation with our timber leasing companies on those lands. So you need a land access permit, which is $45 for a resident. I think it's like $85 for a non-resident. The Mountain Fork has the upper portion of the Mountain Fork has a couple public access locations through the National Forest. Blue River is a good one. Rock Creek, right behind Veterans Lake in the Chickasaw NRA, right there, just south of Sulphur. There's good public wading access down Rock Creek. You can almost get to the lake wading down it. It's got some different species of non-game fish. I've seen a lot of spotted gar in there, but there's carp and river sucker or carp suckers and carp and buffalo drum that move up and through that. So those are your clear water public access. But like I said, here on June 1st, our stream angler guide for smallmouth will come out, but it's going to list all those public access areas. So anywhere where there are smallmouth bass, that means you got great water quality. And that means that you're going to have a multitude diversity of different fish species. So always smallmouth bass are kind of our river indicators. How good is our river? How good is the water quality? Because if it can support an abundance of smallmouth bass, it means you have great water quality, which means you're going to have tons of diversity as far as non-game species go, because they are much more tolerant to poorer water quality than smallmouth. So if you have smallmouth bass, then you definitely have tons of other species. If you don't have smallmouth bass, maybe it's a prairie river, that's different. But if you have a cobble bottom stream that's clear, spring fed, and it doesn't have smallmouth in it in this part of the country on the eastern half of the state, there's some chemicals, some type of either ag runoff, mining runoff, something that's hurting that water quality if there's not a bunch of smallmouth in it. But those non-game species are a little bit higher tolerance to that, so you're going to find them there. Still got a few minutes left if anybody's got questions. Other than that, that's pretty much all I got to give. If there's any takeaways from this, it's 8th ounce weight or some split shot, size 2 to size 10 hooks, octopus, circle, mosquito hook, long shank, bait holding hook, and just anything that you can put a piece of worm on. But favoring the smaller side, size 10, probably going to put you in a better position to get hooked up more often. Not just getting bit. You can get bit all day with a worm on, but if the hook's too big, that's, they're able to pull the bait off of it. They never actually ingested it. They feel the hook point, whatever it may be. So starting off on the smaller side, smaller weight, couple worms, or a couple worms and a pack of some type of dough bait. Have 2 rods go and see which one works better. As you move up from there, like I said, these night crawler harnesses are great because, again, you're pulling a worm, but you're getting a little bit extra flash in it. So your bycatch can be walleye, sauger. I've had bass and catfish hit these, but you catch a lot of drum on these. You can catch buffalo doing the same thing, but really good drum catcher. And then if you're in a river or creek, if you can fish a worm off the bottom, great. But that is the time to kind of get more adventurous with maybe throwing a small inchworm type bait, whether it's a green weenie fly or a trout magnet soft plastic, or using very small size 16 and smaller nymphs and mayfly and caddis patterns. Might go with a bright flashy one like a Bloody Mary or a lightning bug, but it's very basic. Medium tackle, medium action rods, 5 weight, 6 weight fly rods. 8 pound test is a good happy medium, 8 to 10 pound test. I favor 6. Some people favor 12 or 14. It's just completely up to you. Remember, the heavier your rod and the heavier your line is, the harder it is going to be to cast smaller weights, smaller hooks, smaller lures. That's why a medium action 8 pound test, good spinning reel or good spin casting reel with really good drag set on it. Throw that out there. You're going to be able to fight 10 to 20 pound fish all day long. You're just going to have to play them for a little bit longer. You can't just fork them in. But that's kind of the main takeaways for non-game fish. And then if you want to get into the weeds, I'd recommend clicking the link in the chat box to go to our Learn to Fish non-game fishing videos from content creators on YouTube. Go to their YouTube channel, go down the spider web from there of related drum and gar and carp fishing videos, and you're bound to find some guy or gal out there who that's their passion. They only care about carp fishing. They only care about buffalo fishing. They only care about gar fishing, and they're going to go down the rabbit hole of expanding on rope lures and making homemade baits, and different methods of tape that you may use to catch them. Bow and arrow, gigging, spear gun fishing, lots of different opportunities to target non-game fish because they don't have the same protection that our game fish have. But having said that, it is always good to keep in the back of your mind that there are non-native non-game fish, carp, and then there are native non-game fish, buffalo, drum. They are good for the ecosystem. Gar, good for the ecosystem. They are not trash fish. They're not rough fish. They have a place in the ecology of the river or the lake that they live in. The carp do not. They have been introduced and they found a niche in that negatively affects all of the food chain of the native species. So, especially if you're bow fishing, try to target carp when you can, especially if you're just casually bow fishing. Understand if you're in a tournament, you've put money in to try to get money out. You got to shoot whatever you got to shoot. That's one thing. But if you're just casually out there, hitting 100 fish in an afternoon, evening out there bow fishing for no other reason than you just enjoy it, try to avoid shooting those big buffalo and those big drum, because those are long-lived fish that are native, that have very good benefits to the ecology of that water system. How to clean it. Oh yeah, gar, sawzall right down the backstrap. So gar have little tubular backstraps that run down both sides of them, and they're a white fish. All they do is eat fish. They don't eat bottom junk. They are a very good tasting fish. So yeah, if you can take a sawzall right down the back of the back of a gar, you can take 10 snips. If you just get it started and open them up, you can just run 10 snips and open them up and then pull them open, and then you can pull those back straps off the back, just lightly cutting them out. But they go great. You can grill them because you get a nice, especially if you get a bigger fish like a 10, 15 pounder, you get a pretty good fillet off the back of it. You can chop them up and throw them on the grill or smoke them or cut them up, do tacos, or just cut them up into little chunks and throw them in and deep fry them like you would anything else. But most non-game fish, the bigger ones, you can eat carp, you can eat buffalo, you can eat drum. There's lots of YouTube videos out there how to make them edible. There's just different cleaning methods. It's not as straightforward as our sunfishes, our bass, our crappie, our bluegill, fish that we just know to cut them behind the gill plate and go right down and get a nice boneless fillet off of them. So learning how to clean fish. Trout are the same way. You have to gut trout. There's lots of different ways to debone them, but you can't just cut it at the gill plate, go down, flip them over, and get a boneless fillet. Trout have a bunch of bones in them. Most of your non-game fish have a lot of bones in them, so you can't just get that boneless fillet going down the side. So couple of Google searches or YouTube searches for how to clean them. Most of them are pretty decent tasting. You'd be shocked. I wouldn't recommend eating common carp, but a drum or a buffalo or especially a gar. If you're killing them, you might as well be eating them. So getting a quick how-to video on how to get the meat out of them in the most advantageous way to get the bones out and not make them taste as gamey and however you want to cook them. So, well, that brings us here to the end. Thank you guys for watching. This is the first non-game fish one that we've done. So if you can think you ever have a subject matter, we've got 25, 26 videos out there now for this Ask an Angler series. It's mostly traditional fishing, mostly game species. So if you have something that you want to learn about, let us know. Email me, text me, call me. We'll put an Ask an Angler because these are for you guys getting out there, participating, introducing somebody new to the sport when you get a chance. It's a great time of year to get people out catching fish. Fishing is lights out statewide right now. This little cool front is actually going to help extend that a little bit because water temps were coming up rapidly. We went from basically winter to summer in the span of 10 days. So not a whole lot of gradual warm up. So if you've been out fishing lately, you've seen that the crappie and bass and sunfish are all going nuts at the same exact time because now their spawns have kind of been crossed over because water temps came up so quickly. So get out there, be safe. Thank you for attending today. And if you ever have any fishing questions, just hit me up and I'll either help you out or I'll put you to the right person who can help you out. So with that, we'll go ahead and end this and we'll see you next time. Thanks for coming.